Hello, my name is Alex. I'm here with my mother.
Hi, my name is Bernadette.
And today we're going to do something pretty cool. I got my mom to read the original 1986 Watchmen comic by Alan Moore. And the main reason why I made her read this wasn't so we can discuss the comic, but so we can discuss the 2019 TV show by the same name, Watchmen. So briefly, I'll go into what the comic is about. The comic takes place in the 1980s in an alternate future where superheroes are real. And they have a big impact on how American politics plays out. Like in this future, there's this being called Dr. Manhattan, who's basically a god. And because he's on the American side, the Americans win the Vietnam War. And Richard Nixon wins multiple terms, becoming president until the 1980s. Mom, briefly, what were your thoughts on the comics? And compares like other superheroes that you know.
So the comic itself was a little difficult for me to follow. I really struggled with understanding some of the deeper meanings behind it. The storyline, like the basic storyline behind it, was pretty interesting. So that for me was easy to follow, and I did get hooked into it because I needed to see, or I needed to understand like why was all of these things happening in the beginning to come to the conclusion, or how did the conclusion happen. So that to me was very interesting. There were parts that were super complicated, like the scene where there was like that guy in the ocean and he had like the floating bodies underneath him.
The pirate comic.
Yeah, so that I don't understand the significance of that. I don't know what that means or what it entails in terms of the comics. But overall, I think it was a good story, and I did appreciate the dynamics and the relationships between people. Like that was pretty cool to read. And again, just like the deep significance of it, I struggled with that 100%.
Well, I think the most important thing to remember about the comic is that it's not so much more about like American politics, but rather the superhero psyche. Like what happens to someone, what damage has someone gone through to have to put on that mask and become a crime fighter. And yeah, it's basically just about analyzing that psychological damage. And I think where it's most prevalent is with the character of Rorschach, who does have a big impact on the TV show that came out in 2019. So real quick, let me ask you this about Rorschach. Do you think he's a racist? Is there anything within the comic to like imply that he is racist?
In my opinion, no. I think he is extremely conservative in his values. To me, it stood out the most. Like I think there was a scene where he was like talking about his landlady and how she has like 5 children by 5 different men. And his approach to that was like very conservative. But I don't know if I necessarily believe that he is racist.
I'll definitely agree with that reading of Rorschach. In the original comic, he's definitely not depicted as this cool guy, this good character, despite the fact that many fans do worship him just because he broods a lot, like Batman. In the comic, he is the main point of criticism, as he does suffer the most psychological damage from his childhood. And he is very conservative, and it shows in the way he acts throughout the story. But in terms of his conservative views, none of them lend themselves over to racism at all. But it's interesting that within the TV show that came out in 2019, you see the white supremacist group known as the 7th Cavalry wears a mask. So briefly, let me explain what the 2019 TV show is about. It takes place 40 years after the events of the original comic. And instead of focusing on 80s Cold War paranoia, which was a prominent issue in the 1980s, because it takes place in 2019, it focuses mainly on systemic racism and the erasure of Black history, which I think is pretty interesting. So this show is mainly about the erasure of Black history, and you see that a lot with like certain characters. But I think the interesting thing to note is that, so basically alternate timeline takes place after the 30s, when the first Superman comic comes out and it inspires the first superhero, Hooded Justice. Everything before that is regular history. So in the opening scene of the show, we see the Tulsa riots of 1921, where white supremacists attacked what was known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't know if you ever heard about it before the show, but I'll say from my own recollection and my own education, I had never heard of the Tulsa riots before the show came out, and so did so many other people who watched the show. It came as a huge shock to know that this was something that was real life history, especially in a show that mainly deals with alternative history. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I also, growing up in the South, I also never was aware of the Tulsa riots. If it was taught, I don't remember it even being something that was like major historical thing that we had to know in school, not like World War I or World War II. So I think I really truly came into awareness about the Tulsa riots following all of the Black Lives Matter movements that happened in early-ish 2020. Um, and I find it interesting because for me, one of the things that I know about superheroes, right? A lot of comics is that many of the superheroes, their origin story tends to happen around these events that happen in the world, right? So if you think about Captain America, his origin story really happened during World War II, was it?
Yes.
And so going to Germany and fighting the Nazis. And I found it interesting that specifically for this Watchman, considering that the main hero is also a black gentleman, that his origin story starts out of one of the most traumatic events that happened in black history, which was the Tulsa riots. So that to me was just kind of interesting to see how they put that spin on it. Because I also know like Superman, wasn't he also part of, like his origin story was part of the Cold War or?
Well, he is a very American superhero. He's saying his truth, justice, in an American way.
Yeah.
In many ways, he was used in order to like lighten up spirits during World War II.
Exactly.
But he never really like took any political stance like Captain America. He literally there are comics out there of him punching Hitler.
Yeah.
So I want to jump to Alan Moore's comments on superheroes and white supremacy. Alan Moore, by the way, had nothing to do with the TV show. He despises any adaptation of his work or any sequel of his work. But in an interview that was released around the time the TV show came out, Alan Moore had this to say about superheroes and white supremacy. He says, "I would also remark that save for a smattering of non-white characters and non-white creators, these books and these iconic characters are still very much white supremacist dreams of the master race. In fact, I think that a good argument can be made for D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation as the first American superhero movie and the point of origin for all these capes and masks." When you look at like MCU movies, like you look at the first Avengers movie and you see that it is an all-white cast save for Samuel L. Jackson, do you think something like that correlates to what Alan Moore had to say? And do you think things are changing for the better?
Like, are there more superheroes of color now? Yeah, there's more. I don't feel that many of the superheroes of color have prominent roles in some of the things that we're watching, with the exception of Black Panther. I find that a lot of the black superheroes or women superheroes tend to be more of sidekicks or kind of like a backup superhero to the white superheroes, but I don't find that they're as prominent as they should be. One of the things that I recently also learned myself, and I was overhearing, I wasn't necessarily watching it 100%, but I was overhearing Will Smith's new documentary on Netflix. I don't know the name of it precisely, but they did bring up Birth of a Nation. And I told you when I was in undergrad, I also watched that movie as it correlates to race. And what was interesting in Will Smith's documentary is that somebody mentioned along the lines that Birth of a Nation actually came out before the Tulsa riots. And so they felt like that movie, because it really painted the KKK as the superheroes in that movie, that it also influenced the way that people viewed themselves in society. And so they feel like that kind of spearheaded or influenced what happened with the Tulsa riots as well. Like, people felt like we have to protect our race, or we have to, we are superheroes, we need to defend this. And so then that, as a result of that, was the Tulsa riots.
Yeah, I think Alan Moore, he can be very extreme in his views. I don't necessarily agree with him 100% of the times. But I think he's definitely like hitting on something when you discuss his race within superheroes and superhero culture and how that plays a part into the type of superheroes that we see. I think it's an interesting way that Watchmen deconstructs this, because in this show, the main villain is a white supremacist group that follows a former superhero who by no means had any affiliation with white supremacy at all.
Yeah.
So since we're discussing that, let's talk about the 7th Cavalry and the impact that Rorschach had on them. I like you and I mentioned before, Rorschach wasn't necessarily a racist character, but the one thing that was interesting about him was that he was a conservative. And there's a lot of blurbs in between the comics that show like some of the news that are coming out at the time, some of the books that are written in the Watchmen world. And it shows one of the newspapers that Rorschach reads is a conservative magazine that also spreads conspiracy theories and has racist cartoons. And so at the end of the original Watchmen comic, Rorschach turns his journal into this magazine, and that leads to what transpires within the events of the show. So what are your thoughts on that? How do you think that correlates?
I think it's easy to take, I think the issue is that especially when you're talking about conspiracy theories, it's easy to take a little bit of something and blow it into proportion. I mean, listen, Rorschach was extremely conservative in his views, and he was not the nicest person. I mean, he would break people's fingers just for the heck of it, but he was all about humanity. Like, he wanted to make sure that humanity had truth, and that, that if somebody was, in little ways, I guess, harmed, he wanted to right that harm. So he wasn't bad. I mean, he was not nice, but he wasn't like completely like horrible person, right? And it was easy to take a little bit of who he was and blow it out of proportion. And I guess that's what happened between the end of the comic book and leading into the TV show. Like, those little bit of conservative views that he had became Bible to the 7th Cavalry. And so now you see them walking around with the mask on, or you see them, like holding on to these values that in essence was just really his opinions, not values, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting read on it. So we're discussing superheroes and the impact they have on the modern day in this world. I think one of the most important things is the character of Hooded Justice plays a huge role within the show. Now, one thing I find very interesting about Hooded Justice's original design is his costume is very off-putting. He has a rope around his neck and he wears a hood. And that just always, as much as I love the original comic, that never really sat right with me. And that always felt really weird to me. It felt very racially insensitive. And I feel like this show recontextualizes it in a really interesting way. So in episode 6 of The Watchmen, known as This Extraordinary Being, we jump back in time and we see the origins of Hooded Justice. Now, I think the important thing to recognize about this show is that there's a show within the show about the original Watchmen where they depict Hooded Justice as being a white man, because nobody really knew his identity. Like, he's one of the very few superheroes who kept his identity secret. And we learned that the Hooded Justice, his identity was William Reeves, a black man who survived the Tulsa riots, eventually became a cop within New York City, and he put on the hood of the Hooded Justice because he was lynched by white cops in his precinct. So as you were watching this, I remember I was telling you, make sure you let me know when you get to episode 6. I really want to hear your thoughts on that, because that was the big turnaround for the show.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the way Hooded Justice was portrayed within the show?
It was heavy. I think it was really heavy. On one hand, you felt pride in him for overcoming something so horrible in his childhood, and wanting to do good for society. Like, despite the fact that he experienced the Tulsa riots, despite the fact that he lost his parents to that, he still wanted to work and do good in the world. Like, when he was a child, like, trust the law. Like, that was a big thing for him. So he wanted to be the law so people could trust him. And so, you're proud of him for making this accomplishment, because I'm sure in the 1930s, as a black man, to become a police officer, it's not easy. But then as you're watching him and his experiences in his job and some of the backlash that he would experience, like, you just felt bad for him. You felt really, really sad. And then obviously the scene where they try to hang him from the tree, like, that was just gut-wrenching. That was a very difficult scene to watch. I knew he wasn't going to die, because obviously he's still alive, like, fast forward many, many years, but it was just very difficult to watch, and it's always difficult to see things like that. But then you see him, like, really be conflicted after that. So when he hooks up with Captain Metropolis, his main agenda has always been to stop the Cyclops, right, which was the equivalent of the 7th Cavalry in the 30s. But then he ends up connecting with other superheroes who basically take his work and shift it into being something else. And so he's really struggling through that. Like, I want this to be the focus of what we're doing. We want to stop the Cyclops, when the other superheroes ended up taking his work and making it about just being really great people who are helping society. And look at us getting all of our lights, camera, action and everything, and seeing him, like, really struggle through that. And also losing his identity in the process was also a challenge to watch, because he was a black man who had to put on white makeup around his eyes so that he can continue to be Hooded Justice and continue to do the good work. But then also he was losing a piece of himself to the point that he lost his wife and his child. So all of that was just it was very difficult to watch, to say the least.
And it was really interesting when that episode came out. I was glued to the screen. I was watching it as it came out weekly, and I was glued to the screen, and it just blew my mind, because this really does recontextualize the entirety of the Watchmen world, where like the first superhero was a black man and nobody even recognized it, and it goes to show the erasure of black history, that he couldn't really be himself, that he really couldn't be a black man, that he had to hide himself because the world wasn't ready for that. So I think another interesting thing is when William Reeves is in the theater with Angela Abar in the final episode, and they're discussing the use of the mask and why they wear the mask. And it kind of brings it right back to the whole Watchmen theme of people who wear masks are psychologically damaged in some sort of way. And they both openly discuss, Angela Abar tries to say she wears it as a way to empower herself. When William Reeves enlightens her and says, no, you wear it because of the pain. You wear it to hide the anger. It's a release for you, and it's something that's damaging that is going to hurt you.
You can't heal under a mask, Angela. Wounds need air.
And I was curious what your thoughts were on that. Them tying the themes of black trauma into the themes of mask hiding pain.
That's deep.
Very deep. But in a way it fits, you know, in a way that Alan Moore didn't really envision when he wrote the original comic.
I think in little ways. I think most black people can equate to that. There's a term called code switching. I don't know if you're familiar. You are familiar with that. I know you are. And so for many of us, it's like we have to make sure that we're constantly portraying a certain image to the world, right? Because already walking into the room with our skin color, like we're already looked at and deemed to be a certain type of person. And so there's a need to, I don't want to say pretend, but just basically adapt to the environment. But it's a challenge because, you know, there's certain things that we might experience out in the world or in interactions with people that we want to bring our true selves forward, and we're hurt and we're struggling, but we can't. We have to constantly cover that. We have to constantly make sure that, you know, we're saying the right thing, or we're, you know, carrying ourselves the right way so that people don't judge us. So in little ways, I think that was the correlation I took away from that, like in terms of what they were talking about and how we experience things in the world today.
So there was something that you wanted to bring up in correlation to the Watchmen comic in your readings. What did you want to bring up?
So growing up, there was a singer, his name was Javier Solis, and he wrote a song called Payaso, which means clown in Spanish. And really, the premise of the song is talking about how he's sad. He's a sad person. He's wearing this clown getup to make people laugh, to make people happy, pretending to be happy. But yet he's struggling on the inside. So there's like this one verse that I felt like really fit the narrative of this conversation, where he says, I can't sustain my mask. In front of the world I'm laughing, and inside my chest my heart suffers. So I thought that was really spoke to William Reeves and Angela Abar's conversation, in which, you know, they are putting on this mask because, one, they're thinking they're protecting themselves, right? But they're also wearing a mask to do good in the world, to help people, to save people, to make sure that, you know, people are protected in a sense. But in reality, they are hurting. They're struggling. So I just felt like that song kind of tied in well to that scene.
Mom, thank you very much for coming on this video with me, and for checking out the Watchmen comic and show. I know this is something that's brand new to you. It's not what you're typically used to, and I really appreciate you opening your mind up to this and discussing it with me.
Yeah, and I am appreciative that you asked me to read the comic and watch the show. It was interesting. Difficult to follow, but very interesting, and I do like, I liked it overall. Like I give it, how do you say, like a 7 out of 10.
7 out of 10?
7 out of 10. But no, I mean, watching it was a challenge in terms of when you think about all the issues around race. And obviously having these discussions are always very difficult. But I'm appreciative of any opportunity to be able to do this. So thank you very much for asking me.